What role do the humanities play in shaping our world? I'm Robin Ambrosi, and you're listening to the Humanities in the World podcast by the University of Rochester Press. In each episode, we talk with researchers and thinkers working in a range of humanities disciplines and delve into the ways humanistic inquiry intersects with today's social and political challenges, from climate justice to digital culture, from historical memory to ethical futures. We affirm a simple but powerful belief that the humanities are not a luxury. They are essential to the ways we live, think, and imagine better worlds. In this first episode, I am joined by Maya Dodd, Associate Professor of Humanities and Languages at Flame University, India, and Erika Pani, Research Professor at the Center for Historical Studies at El Colegio de México in Mexico. Thank you both for joining me. In this first episode, Humanities Across the Globe will examine how the humanities manifest and evolve in two countries located in different regions of the world, India and Mexico. Both regions have been shaped by the colonial legacy, so perhaps it would be helpful to start by outlining some of the main issues that affect the humanities in your specific countries. Maya, would you like to start with the Indian experience?
Yes, of course. Thank you so much, Robin, for having us here and giving us a chance to sort of think together. It's really wonderful to sort of have a comparative view of things, and so I really appreciate, doing this. So, I think everyone famously knows the British colonized India, and maybe what people don't know is that things like English literature were first taught in India before they were ever taught, right, in any form of the UK. So in many ways, we've always served as a crucible for many pedagogical and other sort of ideas of what constitutes civilized, education. But unfortunately or fortunately, whichever way people look at it, we are left with a legacy of the English language, and that tends to obscure the view of other kinds of traditions and cultures which India is also famous for, mainly because higher education has chosen to traffic in English. And until 2020, you literally could not do a degree in engineering, medical, nursing, let alone many other subjects in any language other than English. So that colonial legacy has shaped very profoundly, in a sense, those who have access to higher education, and also the kinds of ideas perhaps that get more publicity, particularly in terms of intellectual genealogies, right? Because there are so many strains that could have also been part of the public conversation. But for many years since independence, which was in 1947, so for at least 75 years, there has been a dominance of the English speaking world within India. And so the humanities, in terms of their academic form, have been very significantly shaped and molded and even gate kept by the English language. Unlike, Latin America, where in a sense Spanish became the common language, the common language is not English in India, but it is the language of higher education.
Thank you, Maya. Erika, in Mexico, we find a very early colonial and humanist effort in the Florentine Codex, which was drawn up in the 16th century as an attempt by scholars to catalogue the New World. How significant was it for the Mexican experience?
As Maya has said, and thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to join this very exciting conversation. The conquest was a lot of things: violence, destruction, imposition, disease. But it was also a humanist endeavor because the humanities were, on the one side, as you have mentioned, and in reference to this wonderful codex, which is called the Florentine Codex because it is preserved in Florence, was a way, an encyclopedia, to understand this new world, and not only to identify those beliefs and those supernatural deities and those practices that Christianity had come to eradicate in order to lead these new subjects into salvation, but also to create not only this common language on which these people who had been placed at the same place at the same time, obviously with a power relationship that was very unequal, but that would have to build a life together. Not everyone thought in the same way, but also this idea that a new society could be constructed that would be better than the old, and where the humanities ideals could flourish, perhaps in a more marvelous fashion this, of course, lasted not a few years of the 16th century, but it is an interesting moment. And I think in a way the Codex kind of saves that world. You know, this moment of contact and this moment of creation, we can see it reflected in the images and the words of the Codex.
Absolutely. And then the interesting thing here is how the humanities in some way here, they had to present an idea, or they had to, the academics were playing a role, as you said, of gatekeepers. There are certain issues in India which are still haven't been examined because there is a bit of gatekeeping, or has been a bit of gatekeeping. Partition is what springs to mind, but I'm sure that maybe other issues too.
No, it's very interesting, that you would think an event of that proportion should have been commemorated by the states, even if it is tragic, but there should have been some sort of national acknowledgement. And the truth is, there was silence on both sides, or rather, I should now say all three sides. And the fact is that it took private citizens and survivors, sort of descendants, the spark to make this more visible, to make it more known, to tell stories of that time. So unlike the Holocaust, where you have a museum, you have very many efforts at sort of oral historical recall, with the partition, it wasn't until the 1980s, which was almost 40 years after the fact, that there was a sense that this generation is going to pass on without having told their story. And I think this is sort of part of this dilemma, maybe, that the humanities have faced, which is we do honor things that are canonical. We do decide that certain stories are privileged, more important to hear and to tell, to speak of. But the fact is, some of the most important stories sort of come out in very strange ways. And in the case of the partition, there was a fabulous feminist publisher called Urvashi Butalia, who essentially took this upon herself to start recording, women's testimonies, particularly. And this book was called The Other Side of Silence, and it came out in the late 1980s. Since then, interestingly, in the 2000s, there were efforts to digitally record oral historical accounts of the partition. What we privilege in terms of national memory doesn't often account for these tougher tales, right? And these narratives are difficult to process. And even as late as a few years ago, the first museum on partition that was ever made now exists in India as a private initiative. So it's not a state sort of effort, and it's very much about honoring, for some descendants of people who went through those events, the idea that this is too important to not have a mark, literally as a physical space, and also in terms of, digital recording. So there are things like the 1947 Partition Archive, which became a massive citizen historical project where people were taught how to take interviews and sort of record stories. And those efforts really got buoyed by the digital. So that's something that I find very interesting, because India used to be an oral culture also. And the digital kind of brought us back to that orality, which is very, very easy to sort of maneuver, right, in terms of audioscapes. Often university syllabi only privilege the written word, right, in the humanities. Yes, we study text, but for better or for worse, some parts of the world did not think of it as only written down. It was often just passed down orally.
Part of the Mexican Revolution, and what is probably its most visible legacy in terms of the way people think of the Mexican past, is these public histories that were built, that were painted on walls, so in bright colors and in huge forms, and this aesthetic that is very peculiar. That art had a revolutionary mission. And the two faces of it. On the one hand, this popularization and the reaching out to regular people, the idea that they had to draw from popular folk art and pre-Hispanic cultural productions and archaeological monuments, etc. So I think that the way that people thought about Mexico and the Mexican past is very much shaped by this moment. And then this idea by the architects that this has also to become part of the way people live. So houses, buildings, social housing not only fulfills what should be a right, the right to a dignified living space, but that it would transform the way people lived. So it's pretentious, and there's this kind of, civilizational mission aspect to it. But I do think that the way that these buildings and murals were conceived, and then the way the men and women and children, because what every Mexican school child in Mexico City go look at? The historical murals of Diego Rivera and the National Palace, or the historical murals at the Secretary of Education. So those type of experience and the way Mexicans made them theirs, I think is very it's a very enriching and it speaks to how the humanities can really reach out.
Absolutely. I think it seems that in both cases, humanities are called upon to try and help give identity, shape a country, a people, or let people express their history. So we've touched upon briefly how there are these initiatives, these public history initiatives that are from the ground up. How can they become, or are they already part of the national conversation in India, or is there a next step that these kind of initiatives need to take?
Yeah, no, I hear the need for post-colonial countries to have a nationalist narrative, especially at the point of independence, right? There is the all nation come together with one image or one song or, one text. And I think now, more than half a century later for us, there is, of course, this sort of weariness with this narrative, right? That it can never subsume everyone's story, especially given the multilingual nature, the very fact that there are so like the reorganization of the provinces, the states of India, was around linguistic lines, right? So Maharashtra is Marathi speaking, Gujarat is Gujarati speaking, Bengal is Bengali speaking. And even that actually doesn't subsume the logic of that thing because, Bangladesh also is Bengali speaking, right? Just as West Bengal is. So there is sort of this much larger, order at play. But the fact is that all official sites were meant to kind of perpetuate one style of official, right, which kind of controls the narrative. And we understand archival sources, nationalist sort of myth making in a way requires this very simple story. But the fact is that there is a regional pushback, which is to say, look, I'm not seeing myself in that story. So regionally speaking, whether it's the sound of my language or what my people did is not being reflected by this kind of mammoth story that's eating up all the smaller ones. And so necessarily there have been so many tinier voices which may not be as audible as the national one. So it's not the megaphone coming from Delhi, but there are obviously attempts at community styled narration where whether it's regional cinema, regional music, of course, right? And all form of that actually has its own audiences. So I know that India is often thought of as this place where two things unite the country, Bollywood and cricket. And today, there is this flip that's going on where Bollywood, which used to be Hindi cinema, is no longer the dominant cinema. But fundamentally, I think the national narrative is seen really as being but one of many.
That's the sort of the issue at play at the moment in India. Is there seems to be a push for a single presentation of what India is to the outside world. What you're saying heartens me because you're saying that there is room, there is space for all these diverse voices.
Very much, very much. I understand, like as a global, position of power, etc. You have to project some sort of image, and I know all countries do it, right? It's not unique in any sense to anyone. But what people live, breathe, eat, in terms of their everyday, I feel in a time where we have the category of the prosumer, right? The producer who also consumes in some way, that we are prosumers of so many stories. And for that, and because we can make Instagram reels and we can, upload ourselves on YouTube, and we are able to do this for almost 20 years now, right? That's a very significant, that's a generation, right? Shaped by the idea that you don't have to listen to anybody's story, you can tell your own story. So I think that kind of the twin engine, right, of both the fact that language is now, it's not only rendered in text, and there's so many channels of communication, and the fact that you don't even need to kind of own the means of production to tell your story is something that is significantly different for our times, which is why I think the monoplay will not work or stick.
Erika, is that something that you see in Mexico too?
I find what Maya has been saying fascinating, no, and I think it's true. I think that the humanities have always had at their soul, even though there is this production of the canon, the possibility of breaking with canon and to give voices that are contentious, that are contestatory, and that are different. And in multilingual societies, it's true, no, that the state needs to standardize, the state needs to set common rules that they usually want to impose one identity. But the fact that there are now so many different registers and avenues and spaces for intervention that allow for different stories to be told. And in the case of Mexico, I would perhaps insist on what it has meant to be a country that is both in its national territory and outside. No, 1 out of 10 Mexicans lives in the States. Living outside the national boundary and what that means for language, for identity, that I think that the humanities have been energized by this, but they also can record it. And also that the fact that corridos, which are popular songs that have been the object of study for, I would say, maybe over 50 or 60 years, but that now the corridos that are almost spontaneous, that speak to drug dealer culture and are also objects of study that can tell us a lot about these increasingly complex societies.
And this huge expatriate community of Mexican that lives outside of Mexico, are their voices, are their stories heard?
I think that one of the interesting things about this is that perhaps Mexican academia and Mexican American academia have not built enough conversations and bridges. There's a lot of stuff to work with if we are willing to kind of get out of what we think is what the humanities should be from an academic point of view.
Exactly. And I think one of the things that Maya, you were hinting at was how the humanities are taught. And I think I think you mentioned how some of these things are starting to be brought into the national curriculum, or there is a wish to try and bring them into the national curriculum.
It's a very interesting time we live in, right? There's so much overwhelmed with AI and all this other kind of conversation in the room. Globally, I think we're very, we understand that the humanities do not hold in the way they did once upon a time, right? And I think we are in the crosshairs of some sort of change. And there's always been dissatisfaction with history textbooks, right? History textbooks around the world, I think, must receive the most hate, of any textbook genre there is. And it's, perhaps warranted because somebody or the other is going to be left out of that story. So it's never going to perhaps go the way, some sections might want it to go. But that doesn't change the reality that whether it comes to history or narrative or literature, poetry, all of it, that there have to be moments of contact, right? Whether it's in the classroom or outside the classroom, where you get familiar with the bigger context from which you were born, right? That there is some need to understand why you belong to this context or why you can decipher the matrix of that culture, whatever it might be. And the fact is that even if we hate the national history textbooks and all the things that come with statist interpretations, we do want to know stories about where we came from. And those stories may not be, those courses may not be the most subscribed to in the university, especially as of today, where education has become very instrumentalist. People are supposedly interested only in their employable degrees. And the joke, of course, is that computer scientists are the least employable now in terms of the entry level jobs. So who knows? It seems very bewildering all in all. But the fact is that there has to be spaces, whether we call them formal, college courses, educational, whatever spaces. And I actually think people come to history and philosophy when they're much older. So I think maybe the 20-year age group is a little misplaced as primary audience. And that's something we're not willing to admit because we're in this, institutions of universities that have younger persons as students. But fundamentally, the humanities are, as we know, relevant to all of us, right, at all ages, and that's why they can't go anywhere. Like they will stay, they will always be there. Now, whether it's as a history major in a college curriculum or whether it's as playlists on YouTube, right? But I understand that we have been living through a shift of medium and we're not very okay with it, right? As people who are very fond of print, uh, we're a little unwilling to acknowledge that that came with exclusionary, whatever subtext. That is to say, a lot of people who are not invited to that party, are in a sense having one of their own. And that means that history, for instance, is captivating in terms of people harking back to the past to either imagine how it once was or to think of different futures. And I don't even mean literal, like realist kind of approaches. I mean everything from Black Panther, to this idea of sort of colliding with imaginations that have been and will be. And it's a pretty profound thing because if you don't have a source of sort of sustenance, how do you imagine the future? So for all those reasons, narratives we've had, histories we've had, uh, belong. I don't know if they belong only in a college classroom, and I actually take issue with that because it shouldn't just be in a whatever classroom. It needs to be up for public debate, and that's why I think public history is rising. In many ways, it's perhaps about institutions also looking for a new way of being relevant.
No, I think I definitely, I think we need to recognize that education, higher education should be the space where social mobility can be accomplished, and that this should be an opportunity for every citizen. And that the humanities have never played that role, and that the humanities as an academic discipline are usually not particularly popular, but that there is an appeal of the humanities, that the role that the humanities can play outside of inside and outside of the classroom. I think that Maya speaks of how history textbooks are the most hated of all. They're also the most provocative. People care. It matters. And I think that we should probably try to tap into that without getting into these kind of absurd culture wars that I think lead nowhere because we're not really speaking to each other. And on the other hand, there is, I think, this instrumental aspect of the humanities, to think clearly, to speak elegantly. And then this methodical approach to the reality that surrounds us and to try to make it our own and make it decipherable to others. And that, I think, is still something that needs to be done, can only be done with the humanities, which I think also, because it's human knowledge, and human knowledge is everything. So
that's wonderful. One of the things that seems to come across from both of you in two different parts of the world is how the relevance of the humanities and the role, the key ability is building bridges. It seems to be the perfect medium by which we can learn about each other. We can tell all these different stories about how each other's cultures and how each other's stories are important and relevant, and how we are as human beings in different regions, countries, and in the wider world as well. And I think we can probably finish off here.
It was wonderful to talk to you too.
Thank you so much. I think that image of building bridges will remain with me. And, I think there is also this way in which the humanities teach humility. And it's a quality that the world could do a lot with a lot more in our times. So, yeah, thank you so much, Robin, for conducting this and looking forward to hearing many more. Yeah.
Thank you for listening to the Humanities in the World podcast from the University of Rochester Press. Next time, I will be talking to Carlos Rojas and Chi Juan Lim on the potential new directions of the humanities. I hope you can join us then.